The auction house reeked of desperation, sweat, and something metallic, blood perhaps, or the residue of old violence. It was built into the lower levels of Varkos 9, a remote trade station where morality was as thin as the artificial atmosphere. Drezhak the Conqueror strode through the dim corridors with the measured confidence of a warlord who had never known defeat. His reputation preceded him. Even among slavers and crime lords, his name was spoken in whispers. His hulking frame, clad in dark armor streaked with old battle scars, was an omen of ruin. As he walked, the murmurs of the auction's attendants hushed to fearful silence. The auctioneer, a wiry creature with skin like chitin and a face stretched unnaturally long, bowed low. "Lord Drezhak, we are honored by your presence. We have many fine specimens today, fighters, laborers, exotics for more particular tastes." He smiled with rows of needle-like teeth. Drezhak barely acknowledged him. His interest was purely practical. He had conquered half a dozen systems in the last 3 cycles, and with war came logistics. Soldiers required slaves. Mining worlds required workers. The weak served the strong. That was how the galaxy had always been. The auction was already underway. A burly, 4-armed warbeast was shoved onto the stage, its restraints barely holding. Drezhak dismissed it with a glance. A frail, avian-like alien followed. Useless. More creatures came and went, some fetching high prices, others sold at a pittance. Then the human was brought forth. Drezhak felt no particular interest in humans. They were scattered and relatively weak compared to most species that had earned a place in the galaxy. Useful in numbers, perhaps, but hardly noteworthy. And yet, as this one was dragged onto the stage, something caught his attention. The human stood differently. Where others fought against their restraints or sagged in hopeless defeat, this one held himself with an eerie stillness. He was of average build, lean rather than muscular, with short dark hair and a face that might have been unremarkable if not for the eyes, cold, assessing, utterly unafraid. The auctioneer smirked. "A rare specimen, Lord Drezhak. The only surviving human from a recent raid on the fringe colonies. A bit scrawny, but I am assured he is resilient." Drezhak studied the human. Bruises marred his arms, and a dried cut traced the side of his cheek, but the injuries told him nothing. What spoke volumes was the human silence. No pleading, no defiance, just an unreadable expression, as if he were watching, waiting. "Does he speak?" Drezhak asked. The auctioneer nudged the human forward. "Go on, introduce yourself." The human met Drezhak's gaze and, in a voice as steady as the warlord's own, said, "You don't want me." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer grinned. "A bit of spirit, but nothing a firm hand can't break." Drezhak ignored the amusement around him. The human's words weren't bravado, nor was it the empty defiance of the weak. It was something else, something Drezhak had encountered before but couldn't yet place. A soldier's confidence, a killer's restraint. He turned to his attendant. "What's his price?" "Low," the auctioneer said quickly. "Humans aren't high-demand stock, and this one is well peculiar. No records, no known history. Likely some vagrant or deserter from an outer rim colony." That set Drezhak further on edge. A human with no past, no record. That wasn't common, but he had no reason to question the slaver's assessment. "I'll take him," Drezhak said. The auctioneer inclined his head, eager to be rid of a product that made the others nervous. "Sold." The restraints were fastened tighter as the human was led from the stage, his expression still unreadable. As he passed Drezhak, the warlord spoke quietly. "You'll learn your place soon enough." For the first time, the human smiled. It wasn't large nor mocking. It was small, almost imperceptible. "Will I?" A whisper of something uneasy curiosity curled in the back of Drezhak's mind, but he dismissed it. The transaction was done. By the time they reached the harbinger of woe, Drezhak's flagship, the unease had grown. The journey aboard the warship was a standard routine. New acquisitions were escorted to holding cells for processing. The human did not resist. He walked at the same measured pace as his captors, his hands still bound in front of him. He observed everything. Varen, one of Drezhak's subcommanders, walked alongside them. He was leaner than his warlord, his species a reptilian kind with keen yellow eyes that rarely missed details. He had fought countless battles at Drezhak's side, knew how to assess threats before they became problems. "This one's too calm," Varen murmured under his breath. Drezhak exhaled in amusement. "And? It's unnatural. Fear manifests in different ways." Varen shook his head. "This isn't fear. It's calculation." Drezhak gave him a sidelong glance. "Do you think a single human is a threat to me?" Varen didn't answer immediately. "No, but I think he's a problem." Drezhak scoffed. "He's one man in chains." The human had been placed in a cell alone, though they hadn't even needed to force him in. He simply walked inside and sat on the crude bench along the far wall, tilting his head slightly as if listening. As the doors sealed shut, Varen accessed the internal database, searching for information on their new captive. Standard procedure. Even nameless prisoners often had traces in old records. But the moment he entered the search parameters, the screen flickered. Error. Data not found. Varen frowned. "That's strange." Drezhak raised a brow. "What?" "No records." Drezhak's expression darkened. "The slaver said he was from a raided colony. Then there should at least be logs of the raid." "I checked. There's nothing." Varen hesitated. "It's like he doesn't exist." Drezhak's gaze flickered toward the reinforced cell door. Beyond it, the human sat in silence. He waved a dismissive hand. "It doesn't matter. We'll put him to use soon enough." Varen did not argue, but his tail twitched in agitation. He was a soldier, and soldiers' trusted instincts sharpened over years of war. His instincts told him something was wrong. Hours passed. The ship settled into its routine. Drezhak had long since retired to his chambers, trusting that one human in a cage posed no risk. In the shadows of his cell, Oliver Kane exhaled slowly. He had seen the database flicker when the reptilian had searched his name. The system's failure had told him everything. His past was still classified. That meant his enemies didn't know who he was. That was good. He had waited patiently in silence, giving them no reason to suspect what he was. But time was on his side, and soon enough, it would be theirs that ran out. The metallic clang of boots against grated floors echoed through the dimly lit corridors of the Harbinger of Woe. The ship was alive in its own way, humming with the low vibration of its massive engines. Oliver Kane sat in his cell, listening, mapping the sounds in his head. The guards passed every 8 minutes. The doors were reinforced, but not impervious. He could hear the distinct click of the locking mechanism, simple mechanical. Patience. Timing. Precision. He leaned back against the cold metal wall, eyes half closed. The act was important. Let them believe he was passive. Let them assume he was just another captured drifter. Assumptions were weaknesses, and weaknesses could be exploited. The cell door slid open with a sharp hiss, and a hulking, armor-clad alien loomed in the doorway. Its thick, plated skin was a deep, mottled red, eyes black and pupilless. A slaver enforcer. "On your feet, human," the creature growled, voice like grinding stone. Oliver exhaled slowly, rising with deliberate slowness. The restraints on his wrists remained in place, thick bands of alien metal. Too strong for brute force. Unnecessary for what came next. The enforcer's massive hand clamped around his arm, yanking him forward. The corridor outside was lined with similar cells, filled with prisoners of various species. A mix of the broken and the defiant. None of them mattered. Not yet. He was led through a winding series of corridors, deeper into the ship. A large chamber opened before him, ringed with grated walkways above. The scent of sweat, fear, and dried blood clung to the air. A pit. The enforcer shoved him forward. "Welcome to your new routine, human." Oliver steadied himself, glancing around. The walls were marked with crude symbols, likely records of past battles. He had been in places like this before. Fighting pits. Tests of strength. Entertainment for the bored. A means of breaking the willful. Drezak sat on an elevated platform above the arena, flanked by his lieutenants. His presence was a message. This was more than just an execution. It was a display, a reminder to the others of their place. A thick, multi-limbed creature was dragged forward on the opposite end of the pit. It snarled, its beady eyes flashing with hunger. A predator species, trained for this kind of bloodsport. Drezak's voice rang out, deep and commanding. "You will fight. If you survive, you earn your food. If you refuse, you die now." Oliver didn't respond. He simply looked at the creature in front of him, watching the way it shifted its weight, the way its muscles coiled in anticipation. He had fought things like this before. The chains on his wrists were released. The slaver enforcer stepped back. The creature lunged. Oliver moved. To the spectators, it was a blur. One moment the beast was charging, its claws aimed for his throat. The next it was collapsing, gurgling, hands clutching its torn-open throat. Oliver hadn't hesitated. His movements were sharp, clinical. He had sidestepped the initial rush, let the creature's own momentum work against it. A strike to the throat, precise crushing. A twist of the wrist, and the beast's windpipe had collapsed. It writhed for a moment, then stilled. The arena was silent. Drezak studied him with a calculating gaze. He was not a creature prone to shock, but something had shifted. Oliver knew what he saw: efficiency. Not luck. Not desperation. Just brutal, practiced efficiency. The silence broke as another enforcer barked an order. "Take him back." Oliver didn't resist as they locked the chains back onto his wrists. The others were watching now. Prisoners in the cells. The guards. The slavers. The silence followed him back to his cell. He sat again, hands resting on his knees. The door slid shut. Time passed. The whispers began. They came from the other cells at first. The low, careful murmurs of prisoners who had seen something they didn't understand. He wasn't like the others. Then the guards. He killed it too fast. Maybe he got lucky. No one's that lucky. Oliver waited. Later, the database search came. Varen sat before the screen, claws tapping against the console as he input the human's designation. The same result. No records. No identification. No history. That wasn't possible. No matter how insignificant, every living being in the galactic network left traces, transactions, medical records, migration logs. The only ones without them were those who had been erased. Varen's hands tightened on the console. "Reaper." The word was whispered under his breath, barely audible. A ghost story. A name spoken only in the shadows of war rooms and battlefield wreckage. The database shouldn't have recognized it. It wasn't a proper name. It wasn't a rank. It was a warning. Varen's eyes darted back to the security feed. Inside the reinforced cell, Oliver sat completely still, watching. Varen's claws curled into fists. Drezak needed to know. He strode through the halls, past patrolling enforcers, past the dimly lit war banners that adorned the walls of the ship's command deck. He found the warlord seated in his private quarters, reviewing planetary invasion reports. "You need to see this," Varen said without preamble. Drezak's gaze flicked upward. "I assume this is about the human." Varen nodded, stepping forward, placing a small datapad on the table. The screen flickered to life, showing classified military intelligence, scattered, heavily redacted reports from war-torn systems. Single operative. No survivors. No recorded visuals. 0 recovered bodies. Designation: Reaper. Drezak's fingers tightened around the edges of the datapad. He read the reports in silence. Varen's voice was steady. "We need to get rid of him." Drezak did not respond immediately. His eyes lingered on the final transmission from a destroyed battleship. A garbled distress call, cut off mid-sentence. Then, a single phrase from an unknown voice. A whisper through the static. "You shouldn't have taken humans." Drezak's jaw tightened. He glanced at the screen showing the security feed. The human sat in his cell unmoving, waiting. Drezak's voice was quiet, dangerous. "Double the guards." Varen hesitated. "That won't be enough." Drezak met his gaze. "Do it anyway." Varen nodded, but the unease did not leave him. The orders were issued. The guards were doubled, patrols increased. The security system was reinforced. None of it mattered, because inside his cell, Oliver Kane exhaled softly. He wasn't thinking about escape. Not yet. He was thinking about when. The ship was a machine of war, built to endure sieges and planetary assaults. Thick bulkheads reinforced every corridor. Automated defense turrets lined key junctions, and armed enforcers patrolled in organized rotations. It was a fortress in the void, unassailable from the outside. But its weakness had never been external. It had been walking through its halls, unchained and unseen for hours. Oliver Kane moved like a shadow, gliding between the blind spots he had mapped in his mind. The slavers believed their security was absolute. They relied on technology to watch for threats, on numbers to deter rebellion. They never expected that their own confidence would be the first thing he dismantled. The first body lay slumped against a maintenance hatch, throat neatly severed. Blood pooled silently beneath it, its weapons still holstered. No alarms had sounded. No one had seen. Oliver stepped over the corpse and continued. The plan had been set in motion the moment he allowed himself to be captured. The only variable had been time, how long it would take before his presence rattled the ship's command structure. He had anticipated that it wouldn't take long. He had been right. The fear had already begun to spread. Enforcers moved in tents, clustered groups now weapons drawn. Their voices carried an edge of unease, hushed but sharp. The human was still in his cell, wasn't he? He had to be. The reinforced doors had been checked. The guards had been doubled. Yet they could all feel it. The shift. The silence. Someone was hunting them. Oliver advanced through the dim corridors, keeping close to the walls, letting the ship's own architecture conceal him. He had already disabled key security nodes, severing surveillance feeds in select areas. He could move freely, and they wouldn't realize it until it was too late. A duo of guards passed by an intersection ahead, their weapons raised. They weren't speaking. They were too focused, too aware that something was wrong but unwilling to name it. Oliver didn't hesitate. He stepped forward as one turned, gripping the slaver's rifle and twisting sharply. A sickening crack followed as the alien collapsed. The second one barely had time to register the movement before a knife slid between his ribs, cutting deep and clean. Two more down. He dragged their bodies into a shadowed alcove and took one of their weapons. It was crude, an energy-based rifle with an unfamiliar grip, but he wouldn't be using it for long. He kept moving. Elsewhere, in the command deck, Varen stared at the security monitors, his claws tapping rapidly against the console. Something was very, very wrong. The last security check had confirmed the human was in his cell, but the guards were not responding to their comms. The lower decks had gone silent. Varen switched feeds, cycling through different areas of the ship. Nothing. The maintenance corridors were empty. The loading bays undisturbed. Yet he could feel it just like the others. He turned to Drezak. "We need to lock down the ship." Drezak's expression was unreadable. He stood with his arms crossed, his massive frame still, calculating. He had ruled through war, had crushed uprisings, had burned entire colonies into submission. Yet there was something different in his gaze now. Not anger, not arrogance. Consideration. He had read the reports. He had seen the classified files, the ones that whispered of a specter moving between battlefields, leaving nothing but empty ships and silent transmissions in his wake. He had never believed them. Not until now. Drezhak exhaled slowly. Seal the armory. Double the sentries at the bridge. Varen hesitated. It won't be enough. Drezhak met his gaze, his voice quiet. I know. The ship's alarm blared through the corridors. Automated security protocols locked blast doors and reinforced key sections. The entire vessel shifted into a defensive posture, trained for repelling invasions and mutinies. But they weren't dealing with a mutiny. They were dealing with one man, and he was already inside. Oliver adjusted his grip on the rifle as the emergency lighting bathed the corridors in red. Good. That meant they were aware now. That meant the hunt was nearing its end. A heavy stomp echoed through the hall ahead as a squad of enforcers rounded the corner. Fully armored, weapons primed. They had no idea how close they had already come to their deaths. Oliver raised his rifle and fired. The first shot was precise, taking down the lead enforcer before they could react. The second dropped before it could turn. The third managed to raise his weapon, but Oliver was already moving. He slid low, avoiding the return fire, closing the distance before they could adjust. A blade in the gut, a rifle, but to the temple. Two more down. The last slaver hesitated. That was all Oliver needed. A sharp strike to the throat, a twist, and silence followed. The bodies slumped to the floor. Oliver didn't stop. He pressed forward, slipping into the maintenance tunnels, heading toward the core systems. He had already mapped the ship's weaknesses. He had studied the slavers' habits, their rotations, their blind spots. He reached a security terminal and overrode the access, triggering localized failures across the ship's grid. Darkness spread in sections. Hallways flickered. The crew's comm system scrambled. Panic. It was spreading fast. Drezhak stood on the bridge, watching the chaos unfold across the security feeds. His ship, his fortress, was crumbling from the inside. This was not war. This was annihilation. Varen turned to him, voice sharp. We need to abandon ship. Drezhak's fists clenched. He had ruled with fear for years, had crushed empires, had enslaved entire civilizations. He had never run. But this wasn't war. This was him. He turned to issue the evacuation order. Then the lights went out. Total blackout. And a voice cold, quiet, right behind him. You should have never taken humans. The last thing Drezhak saw was his own reflection in the glass before the blade sliced across his throat. The bridge of the harbinger of woe was silent. Not the silence of stillness, but the kind that followed devastation. The kind that seeped into the bones, that weighed on the air, thick and suffocating. The warlord's body lay sprawled across the cold metal floor, his massive frame reduced to nothing more than a corpse. His black armor, once a symbol of terror across the stars, was slick with the dark ichor of his own blood. His eyes, still open, stared blankly at the ceiling, frozen in disbelief. Oliver Kane stood over him, exhaling slowly. The fight had not lasted long. Drezhak was a warlord, a conqueror, but in the end he was predictable. He had relied on brute strength, on intimidation, on fear. None of those things had saved him. None of them had ever mattered. Oliver wiped the blood from his blade and turned. Varen stood rigid near the command console, his scaled fingers hovering over the security controls. He had seen the entire execution unfold in mere seconds. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Just death, swift and inevitable. The reptilian commander did not reach for his weapon. His chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled breaths, his gaze locked onto Oliver's with the wariness of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. He had always been a survivor, and survivors knew when they had lost. Oliver tilted his head slightly. I gave you a warning, he said, voice quiet. Varen swallowed hard. I know. The alarms still blared, though they sounded distant now, like echoes of a dying beast. The ship's systems were failing one by one, cut apart at the core, sabotaged from within. The slavers were scattering, fleeing into escape pods, their fear overriding whatever loyalty they might have had. Their empire was crumbling in real time, its foundation shattered by a single man. Oliver stepped forward, toward the command console. Varen instinctively took a step back, then stopped himself. He was unarmed. It wouldn't have mattered if he wasn't. "You can still walk away," Oliver said, placing a hand on the terminal. "But if you ever take part in something like this again, I will find you." Varen hesitated for only a second before nodding. He knew a second chance when he saw one. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the exit, his tail lashing once behind him before disappearing down the corridor. Oliver keyed in the command sequence, overriding the ship's distress beacon. Instead of an emergency call for reinforcements, he transmitted something else entirely, a message. Not just to the harbinger of woe, but to every slaver ship in its network, to every system under Dreshak's influence. The screen flickered, and then his voice carried across the void. To every slaver in the galaxy. To every warlord, every traitor, every creature that believes humanity is weak. Listen carefully. The ship's systems crackled as his message pulsed outward, spreading like wildfire through communication relays, bouncing between outposts and hidden stations, carried to the farthest reaches of space. "If you take a human, you don't get to keep them." A security feed played in the background, showing the carnage he had left behind. The bodies of enforcers littering the corridors, the smoldering wreckage of the armory, the still form of Dreshak himself. "You don't get to live?" The message cut out. Oliver exhaled slowly. It was done. The slaver network would tear itself apart in the aftermath, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to determine if it was a fluke, if he was one man or the beginning of something worse. It didn't matter. Fear was a weapon. He had given them something to fear. He turned from the console, moving through the bridge with practiced ease, stepping over bodies, past flickering lights, through the automated doors that had once sealed this place like a tomb. The halls were nearly empty now. Only the dead remained. He made his way toward the lower decks, toward the escape pods. A few remaining prisoners still clung to the shadows, staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror. Some would make it out. Some wouldn't. That wasn't his concern. As he stepped into the launch bay, the floor trembled beneath him. The ship was beginning to tear itself apart. The self-destruct sequence hadn't been triggered, but its wounds were too severe. Fires had broken out in multiple sections, electrical failures cascading like falling dominoes. He reached an escape pod and keyed in the sequence. The hatch hissed open, revealing the small, compact interior. He turned one last time, surveying the wreckage, the destruction, the chaos he had wrought. The galaxy had never truly understood what humans were. Now they would learn. Oliver stepped inside, sealed the hatch, and launched into the void. The ship shrank behind him, a dying behemoth consumed by its own arrogance. As he drifted away, he allowed himself a single, fleeting moment of stillness. His mission was complete. The legend of the Reaper would spread, and the message would remain. Never take humans.